Those of you who came here, I thank you that you came, because Becca came to me with the initiative. I must say that I forgot to restart what we had last year as postdoctorate seminar. We like to have interactions between PhD students and postdoctoral students and as many faculty as we can recruit. The problem that we all know that we have maybe too many seminars, but the purpose of this seminar is first to allow students, we were just consulting Noah and I now about what she wants to do, so to allow students to begin to understand what kind of projects are being done here. The second is to train people who want to be trained to give lectures in a better way. So you are most welcome to give comments about any of the issues that are interesting. And of course, the third one, and the most important one, is to hear about science, to discuss science. We call it the Nervous Club because this is something I like, but I just heard that there is someone in the life science or somewhere who said, this is our seminar, you cannot take the name. So maybe we'll have to switch the name back, I don't care. In fact, I don't know that this seminar exists because it existed 25 years ago. And the meaning in English and in Hebrew it was Mordona Atzbanit. It is exactly this, that we are a little bit nervous here. We are not just studying the nervous system, we are nervous, we allow ourselves to address the speaker and tell him, what's wrong here? Okay? And thank you very much for doing this. We hope that all of you will recruit more people that will participate in this event as much as possible. And today, it's your stage.
Thank you, Elon. Okay, so let me start off giving you some quick background on the whole connectomics enterprise. Okay. So connectome is the wiring diagram of neurons in the nervous system. Okay, so for the purpose of this talk, I mean only the specific wiring diagram of individual neurons. So there's also the mesoscale connectome in which people look at projections of nerve fibers and so forth. But I won't be talking about that. So it's just individual neurons and the connections between them. Okay. So the C. elegans connectome was in fact determined quite a long time ago in 1986 after a 15-year effort. Much of it was manual, and however recently there's been sort of a renaissance, if you will, in this enterprise, and there have been a bunch of experimental advances which have brought the prospect of ascertaining the connectome of more complex organisms closer to reality. And early work has already reconstructed parts of circuits such as the direction selectivity circuit in the retina, orientation selectivity circuit in the mouse visual cortex, and a near complete wiring diagram of C. elegans, again, to demonstrate that the feasibility of this with the new technique, which is completed, I think, in much shorter than 15 years. And more recently, the motion detection circuitry in the fruit fly visual system, and the dense reconstruction of the inner plexiform layer in the mouse retina. So the main current bottleneck in these connectomics efforts is the automated reconstruction, the reliable automated reconstruction of the 3D structure from the 2D electron microscopy slice images. So all of the current efforts, especially the ones I cited, use electron microscopy. No, there have been other proposals, but as of date, electron microscopy looks like the most promising way in which connectomics would be done. So I will sort of, in today's talk at least, at the back of my mind, imagine that electron microscopy is the way we are doing it. Okay, and so therefore, because of the bottleneck, early work has primarily relied on manual reconstructions. Okay, notably with an army of undergraduates in Germany and more recently crowdsourcing efforts such as iWire, and for example Moritz Helmstadter was here last week and talking about the fact that he is collaborating with game developers to somehow embed this in games so that they can reconstruct it using computer games. So the broad expectation is that we will have the capability to decipher the structures of several several physiologically well-studied circuits, the retina and the cortical column, by the end of the decade. Now, these efforts have not been without debate. Okay, the debate primarily centers on the issue of how useful this data is actually going to prove to be eventually. Okay, in particular, ascertaining the detailed physiological properties of all the neurons and the connectomes is out of the scope of all of these projects, and indeed out of reach of current experimental technology. And further, for most circuits in the brain, it's not well understood what high-level computations they are involved in. Okay? And this is especially true as one moves away from the sensory or the motor periphery. And so therefore it's unclear to what extent knowledge of the connectome alone will advance a mechanistic understanding of the computation that is going on in these neuronal circuits. Okay, so all this sounds very pessimistic, but the fact of the matter is that the connectome will give us an additional piece of information. So the optimistic view is to look at it and say how can we what extra mileage can we get out of this additional information, and what are the opportunities? Okay. So in my view, the key questions, okay, are the following: what can we learn from the wiring diagram alone, even when the specific high-level function of the neural circuit may be unknown? And are there fundamental limits to what can be learned from this wiring diagram alone in the absence of more detailed physiological information? Now, proponents for connectomics argue that the structure of a neural circuit places fundamental constraints on what the neural circuit can compute. Okay. And however, the nature and scope of these constraints are not well understood. Okay. So this presents opportunities for theory, specifically in understanding what kinds of constraints the wiring diagram imposes on computation, and consequently how we can best use the knowledge of the wiring diagram fruitfully. Okay. So what do I mean by constraints? Okay. So what does it mean for... Yeah.
May we ask questions?
Mm-hmm.
Please don't say that we should, right?
Please, absolutely. Make me nervous.
My problem is the connectomics.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually take a snapshot
Mm-hmm.
of the system
Mm-hmm.
at one time.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the brain is highly plastic.
Right.
It changes from moment to moment.
Mm-hmm.
So what a snapshot of the connectivity without the physiology
Mm-hmm.
will help you?
Hopefully, you'll be less skeptical at the end of the talk. So what I'm trying to argue is that you can still infer some things, at least at the time the snapshot was taken. Maybe the animal learns and does something else, but at the time the snapshot was taken, some sort of mechanistic understanding of how computation is going on.
But you have a snapshot at a certain time,
Right.
without the physiology.
Yes.
Because even if you see this bulb with the vesicles, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean anything.
I agree with you.
So why do you want to do that? Does the connectivity within the brain is the limiting factor of understanding it?
Say the same thing about physiology. You measure
No.
cell right now.
Physiology, I measure something at a given time.
Okay.
And I can see what happened in the next.
You measure very
And I measure only once. But here, it doesn't show anything.
I mean, it could.
You have problem in connectivity. The connectivity is not the limiting factor to understand the brain.
That's the question. That's the theoretical question.
Suppose it was not changing from moment to moment. Suppose it was fixed.
How fast is it
changing?
changing?
Suppose it was fixed within the next hour. Let's say. Then you will endorse.
No.
So it's not a matter of changing.
All together.
So I think Yossi presents one view that you mentioned. There is a debate, and you know, many years ago, there were people like Nobel Prize laureates who declared in very big crowds that once we know all the wiring,
Mm-hmm.
we can put in something
Mm-hmm.
like activity or some principle, and then what happening is that there is constraints by the structure, and these constraints are what we should study, and from them learn about what to predict in the
There is no
activity.
problem with the gross anatomy. That's important. But to go to the detail
Right.
of how many
This is
terminals, where
I
they are
completely tells us nothing. But
You
we
don't
can
remember
talk about
the
infinity.
diagram of Van Essen, of the connection in the
This is not.
brain?
This is what led us to think. This dichotomy led us to think that there is a feed-forward processing, which is completely wrong. It did not talk about two ways. This just
And the comic would solve it.
implanted in our thoughts the idea that this area and this area are connected and what? Nothing.
Maybe you should
I think,
continue.
I think that,
The question he came to.
okay, so
Maybe you will answer it.
maybe I will, okay, maybe you'll be convinced at the end of my talk. Okay, alright, so what does it mean for structure to constrain what a neural circuit can do? To answer Jeff's question. Okay, so let's say I have this circuit, okay, so I pull out some nanometer square, micrometer square of your cortex, and here's what I see. Okay. Now, if I had intuitively, if I had perfect information on this circuit, okay, including up to the atomic level, let's say, and so in principle, okay, and if I knew the afferent input coming in principle, I should be able to predict what the circuit is doing, right? At least broadly, I think you will agree. So intuitively, now obviously I won't have perfect information. Okay. So intuitively, if I turn the dial from perfect information to no information about the circuit, okay, before that. So I said that if you had perfect information, you could predict what its output would be, what computation it is doing. Okay. And what that means is that you are ruling out all but one computation that this circuit is doing. So by one computation, when this afferent input arrives, when this particular pattern of spikes arrives. So when you turn the dial from perfect information to no information, what I'm intuitively it's attractive to think of it as you're ruling out. You will be able to rule out less and less number of computations. So when you have perfect information, you'll be able to rule out all but one computation. Okay. And as you have less and less information, you should still be able to rule out a few computations. Okay. And so in principle, therefore, connectomic information ought to allow us to rule out some computations that the circuit could be doing. Okay. So so with that preface, let me now discuss some work that we've been doing towards looking at such constraints in feed-forward networks. Okay. So all of this is work with Arulava Banerjee in Florida. So what we do is we study feed-forward networks equipped with neurons that obey deterministic spiking neuron model. Okay. And in particular, we ask what computations networks of specific architectures cannot perform, no matter what response properties each of the neurons may have. Okay. So the implication then is that owing to the structure of the network, it's unable to effect the computation in question. Okay. And in addition, to rule out the possibility that the computation in question is so hard that no network can actually do it, okay, and therefore the current network can't do it. We also stipulate the need to show another network of a different architecture composed of simple neurons that can in fact effect this computation. So the goal will be to establish results of this form for various network architectures after setting up a mathematical framework within which these questions can be rigorously posed. So again, so for some quick preliminaries, again, so when I see a neural circuit, as far as I'm concerned for the rest of the talk, I see spikes coming in and spikes going out. So it's sort of this translation from spike trains to spike trains. Okay, that is what the neural circuit is doing, and this is probably what information processing and cognition in the brain is. Okay, but that's a tall claim. But okay, and in particular, I make no assumptions on high-level tasks being done by this circuit. Okay, so just physical spike trains to spike trains, and I make no overarching assumptions on the neural code as well. Okay, and like I said, I'm assuming precise spike times. Okay, so what neuron model should be used in this setting? So setting is one in which we know the wiring diagram, okay, but lack detailed information on the response properties of the neurons. Now, even so, it's reasonable to assume that the neurons obey a small number of elementary properties example, if we have spiking neurons, that they have an absolute refractory period. Okay, and that if a neuron receives no input for sufficiently long, that it settles to a resting potential, okay, which is less than the threshold required to elicit a spike. So these kinds of things. So I'll get to it in a slide. But so we wish to have a model that's contingent on a small number of such basic properties, okay, but whose responses are unconstrained otherwise, in order to allow for a large class of possible responses.
Do you have noise in the net?
I don't treat noise in this work. Okay, so no, so in this work there will not be any noise. Okay. Okay. So another way to think about the models is one that brings under its umbrella several other neuron models that satisfy the properties that this model is contingent on. Okay. So so what it will turn out is that the properties that I assume are satisfied up to arbitrary accuracy by models such as the leaky integrated fire and the spike response model. Okay. So in some sense you can view this as a generalization of those models. Okay. And the other strong reason is that this allows me the possibility of incrementally adding more properties to the neuron model and studying how that further constrains computation. Okay. This models a scenario where we have more detailed information on the neurons. Okay. So here is my okay. Here are my assumptions. So for my single neuron, I'm assuming that I have these. So the membrane potential of the neuron at this point is a function of the inputs. Okay, so this is the input and this is the output produced by this neuron. Okay. So I'm assuming the membrane potential is a function of input spikes sitting in this red window and output spikes sitting in this green window. So you can think of this as this is the time scale at which it integrates afferent input. Okay, and the membrane potential is also modulated by recent spiking output of the neuron itself. Okay, so things like your relative refractory period and so forth. Okay, so as I move along in time, this window moves as well, and the membrane potential becomes a function of these two. Okay, so I'll call this the length of the input window epsilon, and the length of this output window rho, so rho will correspond to the notion of a relative refractory period. Okay, so so in effect, what I'm assuming is that there exists a membrane potential function P, okay, which can be written down as a function of the spike sitting in these two windows, okay, and the domain of this function is finite dimensional because there can only be so many spikes sitting here due to the absolute refractory period. Okay. Okay, so this is just afferent number 3. Spike number 2, if you will. Okay, the subscript is the afferent number. So this is 1, 2, and 3, and this is the first spike. This is the second spike, and this is afferent number 5, and this is the first spike. Okay, and likewise for the output, where you have 0 instead of for the output. Okay, so all right. So I'm assuming that such a membrane potential function exists. Okay. And further, okay, so I abbreviate this as P of chi comma x0. This is the input. This is its own recent past output. So my spike train is just an increasing sequence of real numbers. Okay, and chi is a bunch of spike trains. Okay, and so phi is an empty spike train. Tau is my threshold, and alpha is the absolute refractory period. Okay. So here are the other properties that I assume. So one is like I mentioned, absolute refractory period. So the membrane potential, the P function is less than tau if there has been an output spike in the past alpha milliseconds. Okay, and relative refractory period. Okay, so this maybe requires a bit of explanation. So suppose, oops. Okay. So let's say I had a situation in which there's a certain pattern of input spikes sitting inside my input window. Okay, However, in the relatively recent past, this neuron hasn't produced any output spikes. Okay, in the output window, there are no output spikes. So that is case 1. Case 2, if I had the same pattern of input as here, sitting in the input, but some spikes in the output. Okay, so the assumption is that in case 2, the membrane potential is less than or equal to case 1. Okay, so the intuition is that the recent output spikes here will cause sort of an after hyperpolarization of the membrane potential. Okay, and number 3, resting potential. So if I don't receive any input, okay, my membrane potential is 0, and I should mention that the threshold tau is actually strictly bigger than 0. So in particular, the neuron cannot produce spikes. Okay, now so you can write this down very formally. Okay, so again, one thing that I should mention is that so in what I'm going to talk, so everything is going to be laid out very formally, and every technical claim that I'll make will be backed up with a proof, with a rigorous mathematical proof. Okay, so you want to make all of this rigorous because you want to say what a neural circuit cannot do. So you have to. It's hard to do a numerical simulation to show it, although maybe you could. I don't know. All right, so you can write this down formally. Okay, so we don't model many phenomena, as Yossi pointed out. No stochastic variability in the response of neurons, no synaptic plasticity either, and we don't model plateau potential. So there are some neurons, notably pacemaker neurons, in which the membrane potential doesn't decay down to the resting potential. Okay, and these are usually used to produce rhythmic output. Okay, so that our model will not account for. Well, my P function will have to change. Will have to be a function of time. The function itself will have to be a function of time.
Still just a function of the spikes, of the past spikes.
No, but my window is bounded. So my epsilon and rho are fixed. For if you have a neuron, they are fixed. Okay. So if I make them infinitely long, then maybe.
Infinitely long. So you could have like short-term plasticity.
You could, yeah, you could. In
you just make it longer.
In principle, yes. Okay. So if your epsilons and rhos are on the time scale of short-term plasticity, you could. Okay, so no neuromodulation, no gap junctions either, so I'm just assuming chemical synapses, no F-haptic effects, okay, and no glial cell effects, which by the way aren't entirely well understood, okay, at this point in time. Okay, so what does computation mean in the context of feed-forward networks? Okay, so we wish to treat the setting in which the network is receiving a stream of input okay, that is not necessarily starting from quiescent. So if you have a neuron in the brain, it's always receiving input, right? There's no starting point before which it doesn't receive any input, and it doesn't start afresh, so to speak. So it's always, so we want to treat that setting, okay? So let's start from the case of a single neuron. Intuitively, it's attractive to think of a single neuron as a bounded time spike train to spike train transformation. Okay. So what do I mean by this? So intuitively, it's attractive to look at a single neuron and say that the membrane potential at any point in time is a function of just some recent input spikes that the neuron received. Okay. However, this turns out that this intuition is not correct in general. Okay. And the reason is that the output of the membrane potential of the neuron is also dependent on its own recent past output. Okay, so there's sort of a chain that could go back. Okay, and it turns out that you can show examples in which the membrane potential of a neuron may depend on input that it received arbitrarily long ago. Okay, and here is the example. Okay, so here is the single input spike train that my toy neuron is receiving, and here is the output spike train, and you'll see a membrane potential trace here, and this is the threshold. Okay, so this very simple neuron does the following. Okay, so the first spike, input spike it receives, it fires an output spike. Now the second time it receives an input spike. Okay, this is sufficiently close so that the AHP caused by this output spike prevents it from spiking here. But by the time third spike comes around, you know, the AHP is negligible, so it can spike again and so forth. Okay. Now the claim is that the membrane potential right here, okay, and note that this is the epsilon, the input window for this neuron, and this is the length of the output window for this neuron. Okay. So the claim is that the membrane potential right here is a function of this input spike. Okay, and why is that? Okay, so if it were not a function, I could make this input spike go away, and the membrane potential here should not change. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so I make this guy go away. Okay, and let's run it again. So the old membrane potential traces are all grayed out. Okay, and if you run it, you see that the membrane potential is very different. Okay, and so are the spikes. So everything is drastically very different. Okay, and you know, I could repeat this gray box that I have arbitrarily many times and make this membrane potential depend on an input spike that happened arbitrarily long ago. Okay, so now what happens is that with some mild assumptions on the afferent spike trains, the membrane potential can be made to undergo a reset. Okay. Specifically, a neuron after an interval of time of length 2 rho. Okay, so recall that rho was my relative refractory period, the length of my output window. So after an interval of time of length 2 rho in which it fires no spikes, okay, the neuron's membrane potential becomes independent of input beyond the relatively recent past. Okay, so here is a picture. Okay, so here we have the same neuron, okay, except that I have taken out this one spike in between so as to create a gap in the output of length 2 rho. Okay, so here is a gap in the output of this neuron which is of length 2 rho. Okay, now the claim is that the membrane potential starting from here onwards is independent of input that happened before this blue box. Okay, and let me do a proof by picture. Okay, or I don't have time to tell you the proof, so I'll. Okay, so let me just do the same trick. I make this spike go away and see what happens. Okay, so let's run it again. So you see that initially it is different, but then it converges to the same trajectory. Okay, and this can be proved using the assumptions that using the properties on my single neuron that I showed you. So you can write a formal mathematical proof just using those 3 plus some properties of my single neuron. Okay, and so what we will then do is if we restrict your spiking regime to the case where your neuron has these gaps in its output every so often. Okay, a single neuron can in fact be viewed as a spike train to spike train transformation. So what I'll assume is that these gaps occur. So when I say that an input spike train to a neuron satisfies a T gap criterion, I will assume that these output gaps occur every so often, so that the membrane potential at any point is dependent on at most T milliseconds of past input alone. Okay, and biologically this sort of a spiking regime is not a stretch, because your relative refractory period is usually on the order of tens of milliseconds. Okay, and neurons don't spike so highly that these gaps do not occur at all, right? So a neuron would have to spike at, I don't know, more than 50 hertz or something for a sustained period of time, for forever, in order for these resets not to occur. Okay, and this sort of idea generalizes to feed-forward networks as well. Again, I'll just show you a picture. So here is the simple network that I'm showing you, which is input is coming in here, and this neuron sends its output to here, and then and these spike trains correspond to here, here, and here. Okay, so so the claim is that the membrane potential in the dark gray area is at most dependent on the input spikes in this light gray area, because what happens is that here it undergoes a reset, due to which its output from here is dependent only on input until here in this. Okay, which in turn depends on input only until here, because this undergoes a reset as well. So transitively, okay, and this kind of thing is easy to show for an arbitrary feed-forward network. Okay, where the argument is slightly more complicated, but you can do it. Okay, okay. So some more notation. Okay, so I wanted to rigorously view a feed-forward network as a spike train to spike train transformation. Okay, and here is the sense in which I can. So given a feed-forward network N, let Gn superscript T denote the set of all input spike trains to satisfy a T gap criterion for it. Okay, so I'll just take Gn to be the union over T. of GNT. Okay, so I'm taking union over all T gap criterions for larger and larger T's. Okay, so that there's no it's not dependent on T. Okay, so each feed forward network N thus induces a transformation T sub N, which maps each input that satisfies a gap criterion to an output spike train. Okay, and okay, let me skip this one. Okay, so now let me get to definitions to actually to ask the question of what feed forward networks of specific architectures cannot do. Okay, so here is the picture. So I have two sets of feed-forward networks. So for instance, you can think of sigma 1 as a set of feed-forward networks that satisfies a certain architecture, and sigma 2 is the union of contains sigma 1. Okay, is a set of networks that, in addition to having sigma 1, also has networks of another architecture. Okay. Now, what I want to show is that I want to okay, so each network here, okay, I can look in the space of transformations, okay, of the type that I described 2 slides ago. Okay, so each network here induces a single transformation, okay, spike train to spike train transformation. Okay, so these are feed-forward networks. I should emphasize. Okay, so what I want to show is that I want to show you a transformation that is sitting outside of C sigma 1, okay, that no network in sigma 1 can effect, okay, but for which there exists another network in sigma 2 that can indeed effect that transformation. Okay, so if I have sigma 1 being a subset of sigma 2, okay, I want to what this will end up meaning is that C sigma 1 is a proper subset of C sigma 2. Okay, so there's a transformation in C sigma 2 that is not in C sigma 1. Okay. And okay. However, the additional technical thing that I need to force is that I need to do this only over input spike trains that satisfy this sort of gap criterion for all the networks under consideration. Okay, because if I have if I'm considering even one input spike train that doesn't satisfy a gap criterion for some network here, what might happen is that the notion of a transformation is not well defined, okay, for that network with this input spike train. Okay, so I have to take the intersection, which is what I do here. So G12 is the intersection over Gn, taking n over all the networks in this bigger set. Okay, and any result of the form above is called a complex. I will call a complexity result for want of a better term. Okay, now there are, okay, so if you didn't get any of this, don't worry, it doesn't matter. Okay, so you'll intuitively see what I'm saying when I'm showing you results. Okay, so what happens is that characterizing these gap inputs even for a single neuron is very difficult, because whether an input causes a gap or satisfies a gap criterion depends on whether it causes gaps in the output spike train. Okay, so I have to so this characterizing this set Gn is difficult because whether a spike train is in Gn or not depends on the output of the neuron when fed with this input. Okay, so it's even more difficult for a feed-forward network because I have to now ensure that all the neurons in the feed-forward network obey this gap criterion. All the neurons produce. So what are all the inputs for which all the neurons in this feed-forward network produce gaps in their output every so often? Okay, so it depends on the specific network, right? So if I need to take intersection over all possible networks of a particular architecture, I am in trouble. Okay, so already there seems to be a problem in the sense that in practice there are practical issues in now showing this with these gap criterion inputs. Okay, so I'm in trouble. Okay, so what I'll do is I will use another criterion. Okay, which is just starting from quiescence. Okay, so input spike trains that just start from quiescence. Okay, so in this case I call it the flush criterion. So if a spike train is said to satisfy a T-flush criterion if all its spikes lie in the interval 0, T, okay. So before 0 there are no input spikes, and after T there are no input spikes as well, okay. Now this definition of this criterion is independent of any neuron or network, because all I'm saying is that it has spikes in this interval and spikes nowhere else, okay. There's no mention of a neuron or a network in this definition, if you observe, okay. So if an input, however, if an input spike train ensemble satisfies a T-flush criterion, then for each feed-forward network there exists a T prime, so that it satisfies a T prime gap criterion for it, okay. And as notation, let Fm superscript T be the set of spike train ensembles with M spike trains that satisfy the T-flush criterion, okay. And again, I will take Fm to be union over T Fm superscript T, so that it's not a function of T, okay. Now, okay, so if you didn't get that, here is a picture, okay. So I had these, so I started off with the ambitious goal of using these gap inputs because I wanted to deal with this goal of looking at streams of inputs that my network is gonna do, okay. But I hit a difficult point, so I said, okay, so let me just consider a small subset of this, which turns out to be the set of input spike trains that start from quiescence, okay. And this is a subset, okay. Now it turns out, however, okay, so now the game would be to prove my results using just these flush inputs instead of the more general gap criterion inputs, okay. However, it turns out, and we can prove this, that there's no loss of generality in doing this, okay. So on the face of it, what could have happened is that I had results that I could prove using only gap inputs, okay, which I could not prove using these flush inputs, okay. However, we can prove that that is not true, okay. So what we prove in the next slide is this equivalence lemma, which says that if I have a result of this form, which can be proved using gap inputs, then there also exist flush inputs that can be used to prove this result, okay. So this was the definition, and all that this lemma says is that this is true if and only if I can just use my flush inputs to prove things, okay. So there's no loss of generality in using these flush inputs alone, okay. Alright, so now for results, okay. So first of all, you can construct a transformation that no feed-forward network can affect, okay. And here's the transformation. So again, when I have this gray box, okay, the meaning of it is that I have a transformation, okay, so again, this is input and this is output, and this is 0 and T. So for larger values of T, what I'll do is I just replicate the gray box over and over again, okay, so that the gap between these two inputs becomes larger and larger. And the claim is that no feed-forward network can affect this transformation, okay. And intuitively, that's because, so suppose I had a feed-forward network that could do this, okay. So in particular, the thing to notice is that I demand a spike here, but not here, okay, after these two input spikes. So the reason no feed-forward network can do this is because suppose a feed-forward network could do it, okay. Then for the case in which this gap is sufficiently large in the input, okay, what would happen is that would force all the neurons in the network to have these two-row gaps in their output, which would cause a reset. So your feed-forward network cannot remember that these two spikes happened. So it'll either spike both here and here, or it won't spike here as well as it won't spike here. Okay. So single neuron versus two neuron feed-forward networks, okay. So here I show a transformation that no single neuron satisfying all those properties that I described can do, but however a very, very simple two neuron network can, okay. So here's the transformation again. So these gray boxes mean that I will just replicate this over and over again to make this longer, okay. So the reason a single neuron cannot do this is the following, okay. So again, the thing to note is that I demand an output spike here but not here, okay. So so if a single neuron were able to do it, then there should exist input and output windows, okay, the epsilon and rho windows of that single neuron that just look at its past input and output in a bounded window and determine its membrane potential, okay. So the claim is that at both these points, okay, so no matter what neuron you give me, and I replicate this enough so that at this point as well as this point, it sees the exact same input in its input window and the exact same output in its output window. So it cannot be that the membrane potential reaches threshold here and does not reach threshold here, okay? Because the inputs to the P function have to be exactly the same, okay? Now, here's a 2-neuron network that can, however, do this, okay? And it's a very simple network, okay? And this goes back to the example that, so remember the first counterexample that I gave. So the neuron N1 is exactly that kind of a neuron, okay? So, so for each spike here, okay, it spikes on the odd numbered position. So it doesn't spike on number 2, it spikes on number 3, spikes on number 5, okay? However, what happens is that when this input comes in, okay, the delays are set up so that, so this input again excites the neuron more, so it's able to spike on right the next one. So it changes phase from spiking on odd numbered positions to spiking on even numbered positions. So what happens is that when an output spike is demanded here, this spike which is delayed and this spike in I2 all align, which cause N2 to spike. So N2 is a neuron which only spikes when all three of its inputs have spikes at the exact same positions. Okay, so here it's since the output of N1 is out of phase, it does not, N2 does not spike, and then it changes phase to become in phase at the output. Okay. Okay. Next we have a complexity result on a class of network architectures characterized by a structural property. Okay. So now I will not only have a single network architecture, but I'll have a whole zoo of network architectures which are characterized by an abstract sort of graph theoretical property. Okay. And here is the property. Okay. So what I have is so I call this path plural network. Okay. Okay. So maybe I should give you the picture. Okay. So here is the feed forward network. Okay. And it turns out that it is path plural. So I'll tell you what path plural is. So what I do is I take one path from each input, okay, and I find I find a way to get to the output. It could be any way, okay. And if it turns out that no matter how I choose to get to the output neuron, the intersection of all these m paths, so m equal to 5 here, if the intersection of all the m paths is exactly the output vertex. That is, all the m paths together don't intersect before the output vertex. Okay, so here is the picture. So I have m paths going here, and they all meet together only here, okay, and not anywhere before. All of them together, not just two of them, or all of them have to. Okay. So this is a path plural network. Okay. So the thing to note is that there are networks with arbitrarily many neurons and arbitrary depth that are path plural. Okay, that satisfy this property. So it's a special class of networks, right? So I'll now show a transformation that no path plural network can do. Okay, so here the transformation is for the case when m is 3. Okay, but I just have 3 inputs. But you could generalize this very easily. Okay, as you will see. Okay, so what it's doing is the following. Okay, so I have I1, I2, I3. So I have a burst of spikes here, followed by a burst of spikes here, followed by a burst of spikes here. Okay, and then once I've done this for all the m inputs, I have one extra spike on one of them. Okay, and then I again start over with this thing of having a burst of spikes on the first one. Okay, so I'm going 2, 3, 1 here, but the order doesn't matter. So burst of spikes here, followed by burst of spikes here, followed by burst of spikes here, and then one extra spike, and I demand an output here, an output spike here, but I don't demand an output spike here. Okay, that's the thing to know. Okay, so why can no path plural network with 3 inputs in this case not do it? Okay, so what happens is the following. So the thing to note is that I have this. Okay, so how am I going to stretch this for larger values of t? So for larger values of t, I'm just going to stretch this interval between these guys. stretch these. Okay. So okay. So with the path plural network, it turns out that every neuron that supplies input to the output neuron, okay, every penultimate layer neuron, if you like to think of it that way, actually will receive input from at most m minus 1 of the input of the afferent inputs. Okay, so so every such neuron will undergo a reset due to this guy. Okay, in the following way. So it will undergo a reset here. Okay, so for instance, let's look at I2. I2 undergoes a reset here and then here again. Okay, so if you if you take two of them, they will undergo a reset together. So this, okay, so that's the way to look at it. So look at the points at which they undergo a reset, and if you move through time, you'll see that before this guy comes, it undergoes, each penultimate layer neuron undergoes a reset once, and before it reaches here, after this spike, but before this, it undergoes a reset again. Okay, so when it gets here, okay, all the neurons that synapse onto my output neuron will have to be, are forced to be in the exact same state here as they were here. Okay, and therefore it cannot be that it produces an output spike here but does not produce an output spike here. Okay, so sort of clear? Okay, sort of. Okay, that's great. Okay, so and this transformation can be done by this two neuron network again. Okay, and it's actually quite simple. So if you followed the previous result, okay, so the way to think of this is that, so in the previous result you had a bunch of equivalent, bunch of periodic input spikes and then one extra output spike. So bunch up all of these guys into a single line. Okay, so I have periodic spikes, tick, 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 then tick, 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 and then tick, 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 and I have this extra guy. Okay, so I have my intermediate neuron N1. Okay, which again starts by spiking on odd numbered input spikes on this, and then this extra spike causes it to shift phase. Okay, so it lines up when this extra spike comes in and it works. So it's really the same network with some slight difference, with the fact that I split it over the three. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So okay. So now I'll talk about limits to constraints imposed by network structure. Okay. So the main thrust thus far has been in demonstrating that connectomic constraints do indeed restrict the computational ability of certain classes of networks, even when we do not assume much about the physiological properties of their neurons. Okay. However, your intuition, even before you stepped in here today, okay, like Yossi was saying, is that we shouldn't be able to constrain computation much just by knowing the network structure and just by making some mild assumptions about its neurons, right? So we will now see a case in which this intuition is actually sound, and we'll prove that you fundamentally cannot have limits. You fundamentally do not have constraints on certain network architectures. Okay. Okay. So what we will prove mathematically is that with the properties assumed for the neuron, we cannot rule out any transformation done by the class of feed-forward networks of depth 2, okay, which in turn can be done by another feed-forward network. Okay. Okay. In other words, what we will show. Okay. So if you like to think in terms of the dial analogy, so when I'm moving my dial from perfect information to some information on the structure of just a set of all depth 2 networks, then that in fact does not constrain me at all. Okay. It does not tell me anything about what the network could be doing. Okay, it could do anything. If I only assume what I assumed in my model, which was actually very mild. Okay, and we'll get to that in a couple of slides. So if for instance I assume more, I could have, but with these specific assumptions, I cannot. Okay, and you can actually prove this. Okay, okay. So to get to the last point, so what we actually show is that for every transformation done by a feed-forward network for arbitrary size and depth, okay, that there exists a feed-forward network of depth 2 that does exactly the same transformation. Okay, Okay, so how do you show this? So one direct idea is to just take an arbitrary feed-forward network and somehow try to collapse the network until you get to a network of depth 2, and then you're done. You cannot somehow collapse it further, so you're done. Okay, but that turns out to actually be quite difficult. Okay, so and we couldn't do it that way. Okay, maybe you could. Okay, so here's how we did it. Okay, so you consider the space of all transformations. Okay, spike train to spike train transformations. So of the form T from the set of flush inputs to the set of output spike trains. Okay. Now you can talk about the transformations induced by the set of all feed-forward networks. Okay. So I take each feed-forward network, figure out what transformation it's doing, put it inside here. Okay. It's this crazy set, right? So other than talking about it, it seems like you cannot do much more. Okay. So in particular, one thing that we know is that there are transformations sitting outside of this, because I showed you a transformation that no feed-forward network could do. Okay, so it's not the entire space. That much we know. Okay. So step 1 of the proof does the following. It says that this crazy set is in fact sitting inside a nice set. What do I mean by that? So what I prove is that if a transformation can be done by a feed-forward network, then it has 3 properties. Okay, and those are properties of transformations. Okay. And therefore, so this nice set is the set of all transformations that have those 3 properties. Okay, so this crazy set is sitting inside this nice set. Okay, so that was step 1 of the proof. Step 2 of the proof, what I show is that if I have a transformation that satisfies these 3 properties, okay, then I can construct a depth 2 feed-forward network that can in fact effect that transformation. Okay. So, and I show this by explicit construction. So I will explicitly construct for you a depth 2 network that will do that transformation. Okay. So in the end, what it turns out is that this crazy looking set is in fact the nice set. Okay. So I mean, as a byproduct, we also end up providing an exact characterization of the transformations induced by a set of all feed-forward networks. Okay. I won't have time to go into more details of the proof. So let me just summarize what we've seen so far. Okay. So our goal with this work was in asking on one hand if we can deduce non-trivial examples of computations that a network could be doing, or that a network could not be doing, given just the knowledge of its structure, assuming that the neurons obey some elementary properties. Okay. On the other hand, we asked if there are fundamental limits to what can be said, given just this information. So we first set the stage by creating a mathematical framework in which this question could be precisely posed. Okay. We made precise the view of computation in feed-forward networks as spike train to spike train transformations under some biologically relevant spiking regimes. And we then showed some examples of transformations that networks of specific architectures cannot effect, that other networks can, networks of other architectures can. Okay. So finally, we demonstrated that the small number of properties we assumed for our model neurons can only take us so far. Okay. So in particular, we explicitly showed a class of architectures for which the small number of assumptions on our model neurons does not place any constraints. Okay. You cannot tell anything, okay, as Yossi guessed. Okay. In summary, okay, this sort of first principles bare bones theory that we have here provides a foundation to build on top of. Okay, so what you can do is to add more properties that you assume, and then see how it places constraints on networks of various architectures. Okay, and what about the road ahead? Okay, so obviously we need to incorporate more properties into the neuron model in order to break this last result. Okay, and there are several candidates. For instance, Dale's law. Is something that we did not assume that might impose pretty strong constraints. Okay, and I did not, in fact, assume that my membrane potential is even continuous, right? So, and in real life, membrane potentials are smooth functions of time. Okay, so that needs to be assumed. Multiple output neurons. This is interesting. So I just had a case where I had a single output neuron, but if I have a network with with multiple output neurons. So if I made this neuron do something, that would constrain what this guy could do, right? So if I could dictate two outputs such that this guy doing this prevents this guy from doing something else, okay, then that might help in getting more results. So complexity results with additional assumptions should be easier to prove, okay, since we have more properties to work with, okay. And I need to look at the effect of stochastic variability in the response of neurons. So the question can still be asked in the setting, okay. So what happens is that if I have stochastic variability, then a network, when it receives an input spike train, you can think of it as a map from an input spike train to a distribution on the space of output spike trains. And you can still ask what output spike trains does it map to with probability 0, okay. What can it not map to even with the noise, okay. And obviously an analogous theory for recurrent neural networks is required, which is a more general case. Okay, this is a big step. And now the connectomics reconstructions will also give us the morphology of the neurons. Can this somehow be used? Okay. And people are also doing functional imaging on a single piece of tissue, after which they slice it and do reconstruction. So an important question is, can we incorporate that functional imaging data, because that should constrain what the neurons could do, right? Because depending on what inputs it receives and how it spikes, we should be able to constrain the response function of the neurons somehow. Okay. And finally, of course, the holy grail for us theorists is making contact with experiment. Okay. So we would like to use the theory to advance hypotheses and make testable predictions about specific neural circuits. Okay. So in my view, the field of theoretical connectomics, okay, I think will be concerned with these and other issues in the years to come. Okay. And with that, I'd like to so all of this work I did as part of my PhD in Florida with Arunava Banerjee. Okay. And the work is in fact in press. Okay. And it should be online in a few days. And if you cannot wait, a preprint is an archive. Okay. And that's all I have. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so it's causal, time invariant, and resettable. Causal means that current output depends on past input and not future input. Time invariant is time invariant. Can I just have 1 minute? And resettable is if I have an input gap sufficiently long, then things get reset. Maybe I can explain it to you offline. Okay, Haim has a class now, so maybe we can take the questions offline. Thank you very much.
I mean, I think my main question would be how does the kind of micro scale that you usually deal with relate to kind of a statistical scale? I mean, when the guys...
Itamar is doing statistical, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, is there any correlation? I mean, do you have any...
Do you want to comment on it? Or?
I mean, like, the guys from Germany last week came, they mostly talk about statistical stuff. They talk about connectivity map of the whole, like a whole cortical column or something.
Well, it's like they cover both sides, right?
Yeah, Moritz talked at...
You should look at the retina data, because that's like a feed forward.
But retina, a lot of the neurons are graded potential, right? They're not spiking. So that's... Okay, cool.
There's a chance like you send me this presentation, or is it
presentation paper?
This one? No, or the paper. All right.
I have the paper.
Okay, so all this stuff is in the paper.
Yeah,
okay.
Everything and more.
And it's okay. And journal of the
computation. It's an archive as well.
Okay, so
I can
just or if you
just say just Google connectomic constraints, and that's the first.
Good. Right, on archive.
Yeah.
Yes. So, is it lacking in anything?
It has everything.
Okay.
It has everything, including full proofs.
Right, and figures and stuff.
Everything.